Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. There are, I guess, almost 400 of you on the call so far, and we're going to be up to about 800 people today. So hello to all of our University of Rochester alumni and friends. My name is Eric Weissman, class of 2010. I'm a member of the Alumni Board, which is a group made up of 25 members representing each of the university's schools, with the purpose of engaging all alumni and students in a lifelong connection with one another and with the university. Today is our second webinar in a new series called Experience Rochester that will exemplify the university's commitment to lifelong learning. We will feature topics and speakers unique to the university, and for now, these experiences will take place virtually. But eventually, we hope you'll be able to join us for live in-person events. Before today's webinars begins, I'd like to share a few Zoom webinar tips to those new to the platform, although I suspect by this point, most of you are quite experienced with Zoom. If you would like to ask the panelists a question, please submit it through the Q&A function that is located at the bottom of the screen. Professor Primo will answer questions at the end of the presentation. If you would like to view this session with closed captions, click the CC button on the bottom toolbar and select Turn on Subtitles. If you're having trouble viewing the webinar, you can call in and listen using the phone number that was included on your confirmation email. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who was one of my favorite professors when I was a student and also my advisor in my political science major 10 years ago. Happy reunion year. So Professor David Primo is the Annie and Mark Gabrellian Professor and Political Science and Business Professor at the University of Rochester. He's the author or co-author of 4 books. He's published op-eds in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other national news outlets. And in 2014, he created the Politics and Markets Project, which fosters education, research, and debate about the appropriate relationship between business and government in the 21st century. Philip Maas, today's moderator, is a member of the class of 2019 and a 2020 Take 5 scholar. He is majoring in economics and political science and is currently conducting research on the emergence of social media-based journalistic sources in East Africa. Thank you again for joining us, and now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Professor Primo.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Eric, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to all of you who are joining us today from around the country, around the world. I was really heartened when I saw so many people registered for this event. And I took a look, and in fact, we have such a wide range of University of Rochester friends and alums represented, going back to the class of 1955 up to and including current students. And I think that's just a wonderful testament to the community we've built here at the U of R. And it's my hope that we will be able to get over to the other side on this crisis, and we will emerge actually as a stronger university as a result of this. But one way in which we can get to that point is to ensure that we maintain an open and free society here in the United States. And that's the focus of my talk today, which is, will American democracy survive COVID-19? I want to start off with a poll before we actually get into my comments today. So I'm going to ask for the poll to be put up here. It's a very simple poll. First question is, how concerned are you about the state of American democracy? And the second question is whether that level of concern has changed since the coronavirus crisis began. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that poll and then report on the results. You know, when you're doing a poll on Zoom and you don't have any real faces in front of you, you almost feel like you need to be playing the Jeopardy music or something to pass the time. But in a few seconds, we'll wrap up the poll, give you a chance to answer, and then I will turn to my remarks. All right, so we had, wow, look at that. See, we are all Zoom experts now. We got record, we answered this at all in record time. So 58% of you are very concerned about American democracy, and almost, 3/4 of you are concerned, have had that concern grow. So if any consolation, you're not alone, right? There's a reason why so many people turned out for this. And despite what Eric said about how much you like me as a professor, I think it's the topic, right, that really drove people to this event. So I want to try in the next 20 minutes during my prepared remarks to put some of your concerns into context about what we can expect about how American democracy is going to evolve in the coming months, and put into context relative to what we've seen in the past. I'm frankly not very concerned about the state of American democracy in the United States as a result of COVID-19. I am concerned. I think it's something that we need to have eternal vigilance with regard to, but I don't think the sky is falling. And I'm going to tell you why I think that the sky isn't falling as part of my conversation today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation now. So again, the topic today, will American democracy survive COVID-19? And I'm going to plan on talking for about 20 minutes today. Then we're going to open it up to questions that Philippe Moss, my current student, has so kindly agreed to moderate. Looking forward to my conversation with him in a few minutes. The registration process for this event allowed you to ask questions, and I was impressed with the great questions we received. I'm going to try to address some of them during my talk. Others will address during the Q&A. And if you have questions that come up during the talk, please don't hesitate to type them in. Philippe will be monitoring those questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can by the end of the session. Really, this could be an entire course, right? We could do a course on American democracy and COVID-19. What I'm going to try to do, though, is focus your attention on three real big picture issues that you should watch in the coming months and frankly the coming years. Let me start with why everybody answered. 2/3 of you, if not more, answered that you are very concerned about the state of American democracy. If you read anything in the news today, you could be you can't be blamed for having that assessment. These are just a smattering of the headlines and a small sampling of the headlines I've been able to find in the in recent weeks regarding attitudes toward democracy. So American democracy may be dying. Democrats and Republicans each accusing the other party of trying to kill democracy, if you will, due to coronavirus. So this is everywhere, and I think it's useful and important to, again, place it into context. I should also emphasize that this is not just pundits, talking heads making these claims. Experts in political science have raised concerns about American democracy. Frankly, since President Trump was elected, we really saw experts beginning to become concerned about American democracy. That's a subject for another talk, but if you look at this map I've just put on the screen, you'll see that a recent ranking by a group called the VDEM Institute, which rates democracy, it's a group of social scientists that rates democracy. They did a study looking at what's called pandemic backsliding. So will we see a retrenchment of democracy in countries as a result of the pandemic? And one of the features that struck out to me of this graph, the countries in yellow are medium risk for having a problem with pandemic backsliding. The United States is on par with Russia in terms of fears about pandemic backsliding. My assessment is that that's too harsh an assessment of where we are in the United States. I think we're at low risk. If I had to color this map myself, I would put us in the low risk category. But low risk doesn't mean no risk. And sort of one of the messages of this talk is the idea of eternal vigilance that we hear when we think about democracy. That we can't take for granted that our rights aren't going to be eroded. That we can't take for granted that elections are going to be run fairly and freely. But that at the same time, we shouldn't immediately rush to the conclusion that there's a crisis, politicians are acting like politicians, and therefore democracy is crumbling. I think it's a little bit more subtle than that, and I'm going to talk about that today. Three main points I wanted to cover today in my discussion. The upcoming election 2020, the issue of civil liberties, and the national debt. Okay, so those are three broad topics. Again, there are others I could have talked about, but we are constrained on time. And so I had to sort of limit my focus, but hopefully we can get to some of those other topics during Q&A. I see a lot of questions coming in. That's fantastic. Again, Philippe is moderating. Please keep those questions coming. So as we turn to a discussion of election 2020, in the back of your minds, I want you to keep sort of this idea of what politics is, consider this idea of what politics is, right? Politicians always have incentives to try to engage in what we might call political opportunism or power grabs, right? So there is always a temptation, especially in a time of crisis, to use the emergency powers at elected officials' disposal to try to increase the level of power that elected official has. This is a bipartisan phenomenon. So we always want to be on the lookout for the use of power grabs or political opportunism at times of crisis in a democracy. There's also the concern that we as a public may leave our guards down a bit during a pandemic. So we may be more likely to let our civil liberties be eroded because we need to have the country be protected. We saw that in the wake of 9/11. To some degree, we're seeing that already today. And there is this, what one political scientist calls the siren song of strongmen phenomenon that may be at work here during COVID-19, that we look to autocratic countries like China and see that they, after some initial missteps, sort of were able to use the power of the state to deal with the crisis in an effective way. Many people argued. That's obviously up for dispute. And so the concern is that the public might say, well, maybe we need to give up some of our liberties in the interest of solving this pandemic more, or dealing with this pandemic more effectively. So that should be in the back of your minds here as we move forward. So the 2020 election. So let me start with what won't happen as a result of coronavirus. Donald Trump is not going to cancel the 2020 election. That is one of those claims that's out there that's been made. It's just not true. So this is a headline from Politico that you're looking at titled "The Nightmare Scenario, How Coronavirus Could Make the 2020 Vote a Disaster." And even under this nightmare scenario, there isn't a fear that we're going to have the president cancel the presidential election. That said, the nightmare scenario that's laid out in this article that interviews an election law scholar who's concerned about the election isn't pretty. There are things that can go wrong in the election, and we do need to be aware of those considerations. So this is a picture from the Wisconsin primary election from a couple of weeks back. Highly disputed election in terms of the timing of the election. The use of absentee ballots made its way through the courts and raises the question of whether or not the 2020 election is going to be disrupted in other ways. And we're already seeing jockeying between the Democrats and the Republicans over exactly what the parameters of the election are going to look like. President Trump has re-engaged what I call the rigged rhetoric that he used during the 2016 campaign, arguing that vote by mail, which has been proposed as a solution for having lots of people congregating in voting places, that vote by mail procedure is rife with fraud and is going to lead to the election being fixed against him. The best evidence is that vote by mail will not lead to a marked, significant amount of fraud in elections. But as a social scientist, I sort of wonder, though, we've run the vote by mail experiment on a very limited basis in the states. Will those results we get when we look at those states, right, very low fraud, will we actually see that if we were to roll out vote by mail on a broader scale across the country, open to everybody? That is, I think, an open question, but I'm not terribly concerned about the voter fraud problem. I think that can be managed. You might say, well, the bigger problem is the president making these claims. And I want to put those claims into context for you. So the chart on the lower left, which I don't expect you to look through all the numbers, that's a chart from my forthcoming book on campaign finance and American democracy. The chart on the upper right is from the Pew Center from a couple of weeks back. So after the 2016 elections, my co-author and I asked Americans whether they were confident in the honesty and integrity of the election. 2/3 of Donald Trump voters, whose candidate was victorious, thought the election was just dandy, right? Lots of integrity, lots of honesty. Only 1/3 of Hillary Clinton voters felt the same way. Now, if you look at the upper right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that, again, you see a huge partisan split in terms of beliefs about whether the election will be conducted fairly. What does this tell us? So if you're a Democrat, you might say, well, it tells us that Democrats, right, know more than Republicans about elections. If you're a Republican, you might say, well, it tells me I'm a Republican. See those Democrats, they don't know what they're talking about. What it tells me is that a lot of what constitutes faith in American government and faith in democracy and faith in elections hinges on whether or not the person you like is in office. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that we need to look at this kind of public opinion data very cautiously. So looking at this data and saying, you know, oh my God, the sky is falling because people are concerned about whether elections are gonna run fairly, we need to always keep in mind, right, that there are these partisan considerations at play. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. So what else could go wrong in the 2020 election? So there could be massive voter fraud due to vote by mail. Again, I'm not terribly concerned about that, though I do think we need to have safeguards in place. Another concern, will governors use their emergency powers in an attempt to suppress turnout or to meddle with how the Electoral College does its business? So it's possible that a legislature could vote to allocate electoral votes based on its own preferences rather than on those of the citizens of the state. Are those scenarios likely? I just, again, don't think so. My sense is that there would be too much pushback from the American people if it were clear that these results were being manipulated in ways that simply weren't justifiable in any reasonable way. The third concern is the one that I think is potentially the most realistic, and that is that we end up in a situation where the election is contested for some reason. It could be that there's a delay in reporting results, which creates opportunities to claim that there was fraud due to the delay in the results. It could be that there are disputes in one state over how the election was run, and that state is pivotal in the Electoral College. And the country is sort of fragile now as a result of COVID-19, and there's a fear, right, that this would be a significant problem. That to me is the biggest risk we face in the 2020 election. I'm not, again, sort of, we've been here before is the message I would have for everybody in the audience. We've been here before, and you know, we got through the 2000 election as difficult as it was, and I think we'll get through this one again. One message that I want to make sure I get in now, just to ensure that we don't, in case we run low on time, I want to make sure I get this point in, is that, you know, the key is that we abide by court decisions. So once we start seeing politicians ignore court decisions, that's when I personally will start to get really nervous about the future of American democracy. Okay, so now let's turn to the second set of issues I want to discuss, and that's civil liberties. Again, keep those questions coming. Happy to discuss them during Q&A. So civil liberties. I'm kind of taking a bunch of rights here and mashing them up into one topic in the interest of time. In general, right, the state will attempt to use its powers during a crisis to make the situation better. But in doing so, we run the risk that we allow the state to infringe on our civil liberties. And again, our guard is down. We're so desperate to see coronavirus eliminated. We're so desperate to see so the COVID-19 infections dissipate. That means we tend to be willing to allow our rights to be eroded. And again, here's where my message of eternal vigilance comes back in. So we're starting to see limits on protests, limits on the press and social media due to COVID-19. And that is of particular concern to me because many of these restrictions are not, in my view, justified on public health grounds. So criminalizing protests over oil development, for instance, that does not seem to me to be the least restrictive way to ensure public safety if you believe in the First Amendment. And we've seen 3 states in the past month or two enact laws that restrict protests with regard to oil development in an effort to, I would argue, stifle speech. We're starting to see states putting pressure on the press or social media in some cases regarding what information they put out about coronavirus. That to me is also a problematic trend, and we need to be guard against that. The The bigger fear I have is that some of these restrictions that are put in place now, if they aren't challenged, will stay in place once the crisis is over, and our rights, excuse me, will be eroded to some degree. So that's something I think that's important for us to all be aware of and to watch carefully in the coming months. The second piece of the civil liberties mix here that I wanted to discuss is privacy rights and health. So this is a QR code that's on the screen. And in China, in the past couple of weeks, they rolled out color-coded QR codes for citizens that are based on the data the government has on citizens and a model they run regarding whether or not an individual in China is at high, low, or medium risk for coronavirus. So you walk around with these color-coded QR codes. And one of the questions that we received in advance of the talk was about whether we're entering a brave new world in American democracy where our rights and our privacy is going to be eroded completely in the name of dealing with public health. It's something that I think we need to be aware of and pay attention to. Because especially now that we have amazing life-changing technologies around the world, those technologies we all know can be misused. And so it needs to be the case that any public health measures that are taken don't begin to infringe on civil liberties so fundamentally that they challenge what it means to live in a democracy. So, you know, the QR code I think is a nice visual for thinking about what, again, public health, sort of protecting public health, how there's a trade-off there with civil liberties and how we need to be really careful about erring on the side of public health and in doing so, right, damaging civil liberties so fundamentally that we can't resurrect them once the crisis is abated. And keep in mind, this is a repeated game, right? This isn't the last pandemic we're going to see. Hopefully it's the last pandemic for many of us, but it's not the last pandemic we're going to see in American history or in the American future, if you will, right? We need to be paying attention to these sorts of things. Last point I want to make, and then I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I want to talk a little bit about the national debt. This is a topic that until last few days was not getting a ton of attention during coronavirus. In fact, it was almost politically incorrect to say, hey, you noticing we're running up a massive amount of debt to deal with this crisis? Because what kind of ghoul would you be to make that argument? We just need to spend. We just need to solve the problem. Well, now Jay Powell is jumping into the mix. It was only February, excuse me, when he was testifying that we needed to do something about the deficit. He's changed his tune as well now. So this is a press conference he gave yesterday, excuse me, where he said this is not the time to act on national debt concerns. This is the time for the government to spend. My response to that is to just have you think about what happens when the bill comes due. And this is a chart from a report from the Congressional Budget Office that shows over time debt to GDP ratio. Basically, how much debt does the government hold as a function of the economy? And we sort of are seeing to the right of that projected line a run up in debt, the likes of which we've never seen in our history. And that's going to come from the debt we're taking on now due to coronavirus plus issues with entitlements. So it is reasonable, I think, to say now is not the time, like today is not the time to say, hey, let's put in a massive set of government budget cuts or tax increases to deal with the debt. But I would just ask the question, when is a good time to deal with the debt? Because I've been telling politicians for the last decade, you should do something about the debt, right? And, you know, not that they're going to listen to me, but, you know, they're not only not going to listen to me, they're actually dismissive, right? We don't need to worry about the debt. And this is Democrats and Republicans. This is a bipartisan problem. So the question you can ask is, okay, if in good times, and we had a really strong economy until a few months ago, now's not the time to deal with the debt and deficits. And during a crisis, it's not time to deal with debt and deficits. When is it? And my fear is that we're going to get into a fiscal crisis, so another sort of crisis before Congress acts. Why is that a concern? Well, that's a concern for the very reason that we're having this talk today, that crises are precisely the time when we need to be careful about losing our democratic rights. So I worry about the national debt because that is another crisis that's coming, and I don't see enough attention being given to that issue from those that actually make the decision. So Jay Powell can say all he wants, whether it was in February or yesterday, he doesn't control fiscal policy. I can go and testify before Congress on budget rules. I don't get to make the rules. Until elected officials decide that this is a priority, this is not going to be something that gets attention. And I do worry about the implications of that for the country's future. So with that, I want to wrap up and just say thank you for attending the talk. We now have plenty of time for Q&A, so I am going to stop sharing my screen. I'm back now in my full HD, and Philippe Moss is going to join us. Philippe is somebody I've known basically since he started at the U of R. He is a 2020 Take 5 student. So he's about to graduate with having done the Take 5 program, doing some really interesting work looking at the use of social media and journalism in Africa. And he's been a student in several of my classes, and I'm so glad that he could join us to moderate. So Philippe, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So before we get started, I just want to thank everyone who either submitted a question during registration or in real time through the Zoom Q&A function. So we're going to try and get to as many questions as possible, and we're doing that through by consolidating the questions with similar themes. So I just want to start with a question that was asked a few minutes ago. So considering the fact that we might have some, mail-in ballots and things like that, how would you factor in the risk of increasing external interference in our democracy?
There's always, by external, you're sort of thinking of foreign powers in that. The best evidence I've seen is that the mail is actually probably less of a risk in terms of manipulation by external powers than something like online voting would be, where you could run the risk of a hack that would be much harder to detect. So will foreign powers try to influence the 2020 election? Absolutely. Again, trying to put this into context for everybody, foreign powers have tried to influence US elections for time immemorial. It's just that now they have better technical tools to do so. On the other hand, I think the US government, social media companies, and others are much more attuned to what these problems might look like. The X factor here, and I think it's a legitimate question to be asked by the audience, is, will our guard be down a little bit because we're so distracted and busy dealing with COVID-19 and coronavirus? That I don't know. That's hard to assess. If I had to bet, I don't think if we're gonna have a problem with the 2020 election, if I had to bet, it's not gonna be foreign interference.
Okay, and so how is the pandemic presenting a window of innovation in election administration? And how durable are these innovations likely to be?
There's going to be a partisan push and pull here, a tug of war, if you will, over whether or not the reforms we put in place to deal with COVID-19 in elections will be temporary or permanent. And it's tempting to argue that, again, these rules are being manipulated or used for partisan advantage. The underlying sort of point there, though, the underlying reason why that there's some truth to that is that rules are not neutral. So these rules, like vote by mail, it's possible they could advantage one party or the other. And so the battle over the rules is often a battle over how that's going to end up shaping outcomes. The best evidence we have to date is that vote by mail doesn't advantage either party, actually. But a recent study looking at Wisconsin seemed to suggest that Democrats did a little bit better as a result of vote by mail. We'll have to see whether or not that holds up. I'm sure there'll be a lot of political scientists and social scientists trying to study the vote by mail and its effects. But I do think you'll watch as we observe these electoral innovations in the coming election. You're going to start seeing debates over whether or not to make these changes permanent. Where I do think we have the possibility to enact nonpartisan types of innovations is with regard to the infrastructure of voting. So, put aside, let's say we have a fight over vote by mail and we resolve that fight. What's the most effective, safe, secure way to physically, print ballots, distribute them, and count them? right? So that's sort of the mechanics of the election. And there, I think we do have the potential for more innovation, because we're going to have now 50 states potentially changing how it is that they run elections, and hopefully we'll be able to learn a lot from the different approaches that they use.
Okay, right. Because we've been talking a lot about the possibility that the post office might go to bankruptcy, and if we do vote by mail, how will that affect how the election will be run, or is it likely that it'll be bankrupt? And so and could we possibly see a private takeover of some public resources?
I'm not a gambler, but if I had to bet, we're not letting the Postal Service go under. It's politically just a hot potato. We'll see a lot of jawboning about it. The Postal Service has been sort of the favorite whipping boy of politicians for decades. Will it lead to a restructuring of the post office? This sort of might be an opportunity sort of to modernize the Postal Service. So for instance, one of the proposals that's been out there for years is that we don't need to have mail service 6 days a week. So maybe that can be reduced down. There can be ways to introduce efficiency. So I don't think the Postal Service is going to go bankrupt. Without a doubt, mail service is not going to be interrupted before the November election. So I'm that I put way wherever the floor is here, the bottom of my list of things to worry about with regard to the election.
All right, sounds good. And so we have one question that was asked during registration by Christian Groves. And we're kind of shifting gears a bit. So what are your thoughts about the attempts to delay the census count and thus redistricting timelines?
Well, hello, Christian. It's good to hope you're out there in the audience. So Christian is actually a PhD from our department who is now a professor at USC, and he's asked a great question about what's likely to happen with the census, and specifically with regard to elections. What does that mean for redistricting, the redrawing of congressional district lines that is supposed to happen in 2021? Clearly there are issues with counting the number of Americans at a time like this. Looking at the numbers, there's enough of a window there between when census counts should start arriving, even if the process is delayed, and when redistricting needs to occur, that the states will have the chance to draw legislative lines. It's also my sense that we're going to see perhaps more lawsuits than normal, and we see a lot of lawsuits to begin with. We're going to see even more lawsuits next year with regard to how those lines are drawn, due to the fact that the census is delayed, and there might be, in some states, might be late getting their lines drawn. So a lot of this is going to depend on the courts. This again is why I said always watch those court decisions and make sure those court decisions are followed by politicians and by elected officials. So I think we'll have redistricting next year. I think it'll be a little messier than normal because some of the census results may be delayed. Ultimately, though, I think by the end of next year, we'll have seen many of those court cases play out. We'll have seen much of the redistricting occur, and so again, I'm not terribly concerned about that. But with an asterisk, it depends a lot on what happens in the next few months. If the census results are delayed by a year, well, then that's a completely different ballgame. And again, I think a lot of that means that the courts then will make the decisions. And this is sort of, again, why the courts are so important. To the extent that we have all of these emergency powers being invoked, all of these deadlines missed under the law, a lot of decisions get made by the courts with regard to what exceptions to rules are permissible. It's a great question.
All right, and I'm going to shift gears towards questions that are related to the class that I took. So as you mentioned, I was part of your Disagreement in Democratic Society class. And so we have a question from Kate Desvignon, who's, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who asked a question about the public erosion of trust in our scientific and journalistic institutions. And she asks, will Americans ever be able to come together for a common cause if we can't agree on the facts? And not just the scientific facts, just any facts.
Gosh, that's a great question. I created a new seminar course this semester called Disagreement in a Democratic Society, and it's all about how it is that we as as a society, as a free society, can disagree in a more productive and effective way. And one of the concerns is that if we can't have a common base of knowledge or even a common set of values over which we're having discussions, it becomes really difficult to move forward as a society. You know, with regard to coronavirus, I'm seeing two sets of concerns, or two sets of issues with regard to disagreement. One is that there's unfortunately a conflation of concerns about outright hoaxes being put out there and about questioning science. So I think there's a distinction that needs to be made there. So, and I worry that to introduce a phrase, the idea of cancel culture that we hear so much about is being introduced to science, where those who question sort of what the dominant view is in science are running the risk of hurting their careers tremendously. An example: Johnny Anitas, professor at Stanford, published a paper put out a paper a few weeks ago arguing that maybe infection rates or concerns about coronavirus in the United States were excessive. And you know, that paper, there was a lot of scientific back and forth, which is exactly what we ought to have in science. But he also was attacked by many scientists on Twitter and on social media, sort of questioning sort of his well-being, mental well-being for writing such a paper. And so I worry that in an attempt to sort of focus on getting truth and worrying about facts, we lose sight of the fact that science is a process, right? And there are going to be disagreements along the way, and what we think are facts are going to change. Again, there are, of course, outright hoaxes out there. But I go back to John Stuart Mill, who famously sort of wrote, the reason why we need to have as many voices as possible in public debate is because there's a chance, just a chance, but there is a chance we're wrong, right? The conventional wisdom could be wrong. And we need to hear from those voices, as uncomfortable as it might make us. Of course, we do want to rule out outright hoaxes, and sometimes it is hard to no, how can we say something's a hoax if there are no facts? Yes, there are facts, but we need to be aware that science is constantly evolving, and we don't want to have a cancel culture in science, whether it's in the hard sciences, whether it's in political science, where you can't challenge the conventional wisdom without fear of your career and your reputation being tarnished. So that's sort of a big concern that I have that's come out of this crisis. It has nothing to do with, in this case, with the government infringing on our ability to speak. My concern here is about self-censorship or mob rule when it comes to democratic disagreement.
Right, so I have a follow-up to that about civil society, and still within the themes of the course. So we have a question from Prasinta Shavrimuthu, and she's asking, what will be the impact on civil society? So will citizen participation increase or decrease? And I want to add, now that we're all in quarantine, a lot of these conversations are happening online, right? And so how does the change of medium affect this?
That's right. So in 1918, when we had the flu pandemic, right, there was no ability to go onto Twitter and sort of say, oh my, to attack other scientists and so on. Yeah, this is a great question. There are going to be two effects in terms of something like turnout. We'll see two effects in November, right? We'll see the effect that people might be fearful of going to the polls if there aren't alternatives to vote because of concerns about becoming infected. On the other hand, we're going to see we're seeing more attention being paid to day-to-day politics, I think, than we've seen in a long time. I'm curious actually to go and look at some hard data on that, but the sense I get, at least, is that people are at least aware of what the president is saying, aware of what Congress is doing, in a way that they might have just be tuning out politics in normal times. The concern about social media is, right, that people don't have their filters on in quite the same way they do in face-to-face interaction, and so a lot of the debates and the dialogues are caustic and problematic. But I would try to look at the glass as half full perspective on this and think about the amazing resource that social media has been in terms of allowing for individuals to communicate and connect during a time of crisis. So my hope is that we're going to use social media in the coming months to in fact, educate and inform, and we'll come out of this on the other side, a stronger society. On the other hand, I go back to that figure I put up a few minutes ago, showing, right, that Americans are still polarized, right? Americans are still divided on lots of issues. There's still a lot of what we call affective polarization in society, where we dislike somebody because they're a Democrat or because they're a Republican. And I don't think that's going to go away as a result of COVID-19. I think once the crisis abates, we're going to see it. We're going to see that come back again.
All right, sounds good. I think that was our last question. Do you have any final remarks, Professor Primo?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is that, a lot of, I hope you don't feel like your 40 minutes has been wasted, because I haven't given you a lot of definitive answers, but I sort of think that's the point, right? That we don't have a lot of the answers yet. And part of what I tried to do here was give you a set of ideas to think about. And watch and observe over the coming months, so that you can be a scientist in that sense and thinking about what the future for democracy looks like in the United States. I'm actually optimistic. I'm actually optimistic about the future of democracy in the United States, because we are, as a country, I actually would argue, very resilient, more resilient than I think a lot of experts actually, and a lot of political scientists give us credit for being as a country. The research I've done in my book, which is coming out later this year, called Campaign Finance and American Democracy, What the Public Really Thinks and What It Matters, sort of delves into that question in a little bit more detail about, the fact that Americans might be cynical about politics. There's no doubt about that. But at the end of the day, right, there is a strength of our institutions that will get us through what we're dealing with right now. I wanted to thank you, Philippe, for moderating. I also wanted to thank a couple of students, Jonah Riccanati and Jimena Reyes, who helped put together that slideshow that you saw. The alums in the audience, I think you should look to students like Philippe, and even though they're not on camera, students like Jimena and Jonah, and feel real pride for what they've done here at the University of Rochester over the past couple months. They had to go from being students on spring break to students who had to move their entire lives, right, from Rochester to their homes, or potentially a friend's house or a basement. I've seen some students taking classes from their basements. And they've done it with, between you and me and the other people, 500 people here, without as much complaining as the faculty. Right, the students have been fantastic and amazing throughout this process, and I think they really deserve a virtual pat on the back for that. They've demonstrated a resilience that I think all of us at the University of Rochester can be proud of. I'm certainly proud of my students, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody heard that message who is in the audience, because I think they're hearing a lot from the news media. They may not be hearing a lot from professors, and I just wanted to make sure that message got out. The students have really been amazing, and a real credit to the institution and the resilience they've demonstrated. So hats off, virtual hats off to the students. And with that, I don't want to run over on time. As students in the audience who've had me in class know, I start class on time and I end class on time. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to Eric Weissman, who is going to, who, after he gets over the flashback of hearing that when he was in my class over a decade ago, we'll close the event for today. Thanks again, everyone, for attending.
Thank you very much, Professor Primo. I definitely feel transported back to Rochester after this session. So thank you very much. And also, Philippe, thank you for moderating this fantastic session today. And thanks to all of you for joining us and for your engagement and the great questions that you asked. We hope you enjoyed the program, and we'd like to hear your feedback. Please take a moment to share your thoughts about the session through a brief anonymous survey, which will appear on your screen once the webinar is ended in a minute. And please also plan to join us next week on Thursday, May 7th at noon Eastern Time for our next Experience Rochester lecture featuring Professor Susan Blackman and her talk on how to prepare mentally and stay healthy during a crisis. And you see that on the screen now. So thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Stay well. And of course, Meliora.